Okay, let's just jump straight into this. Have you ever actually stopped for a second to think about the sheer texture of modern exhaustion? I mean, we live in an era with unprecedented wealth, literally all the technological convenience you could ask for, and yet there's this heavy, persistent fog of fatigue just hanging over everything we do. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating perspective from the philosopher Byung-Chul Han, and this explainer is going to uncover exactly why this is happening to us.
Look at your own daily life right now. You probably feel a strange, bone-deep exhaustion despite having, well, immense personal autonomy. You don't have some factory overseer cracking a whip behind you, right? You might even have the flexibility to work from your laptop at a local coffee shop. And yet, the exhaustion is so much deeper than just physical tiredness. Han makes this incredible argument that the very freedom we prize so highly has actually been subtly inverted into a completely new form of control.
Listen to this quote. Burnout syndrome occurs when the soul overheats. So the absolute crucial point here is that your burnout isn't a personal failure. It's not a lack of resilience, and it's definitely not a problem you can solve by downloading another productivity app. It's a structural disease manufactured by what Han calls the modern achievement society. We aren't burning out because things are too hard. We're overheating because we are trapped in a system that constantly tells us literally everything is possible if we just optimize ourselves enough.
All right, moving to section 1, discipline versus achievement, from should to can.
To really understand where we are right now, we have to look at how systemic domination has mutated over the last century. Back in the 20th century, we lived in what the philosopher Michel Foucault called a disciplinary society. That was a world driven by you should and you should not. It was built on negativity, prohibition, physical walls, and strict borders. But look at where we are today. We've transitioned into an achievement society. It's an aggressively positive environment of you can. We've moved away from a culture of duty straight into a culture of limitless potential, which places this relentless demand for constant motivation squarely on our own shoulders.
And here is the real trap. When society tells you that you can achieve absolutely anything, it completely eliminates the boundaries that used to protect you. The violence of this kind of toxic positivity is that it turns every single limitation into a personal inadequacy. Think about it. If you supposedly can do anything, then failing to do it is 100% your fault. This excess of positivity is just incredibly efficient for economic output because it requires zero guards, zero walls, and no external coercion. You do all the coercing yourself, and you usually do it with a smile on your face.
Let's dive into section 2, the master-slave fusion, the tragedy of modern work.
So this inward collapse of the old class struggle has created a deeply internalized conflict within every single one of us. In Hegel's classic philosophy, you had the master and the slave, two entirely separate people. In early capitalism, the boss exploited the worker. But today, you play every single one of these roles simultaneously, right inside your own psyche. You are the boss demanding more output, you are the worker suffering under that crushing load, and you are the human capital, this ongoing, endless project that constantly needs to be branded, optimized, and leveraged.
Because we mistake the tyrant in our heads for our own personal ambition. We willingly exploit ourselves until we literally collapse. I mean, you know the drill. Answering emails at midnight, turning your relaxing hobbies into profitable side hustles, tracking your sleep cycles just so you can be a tiny bit more productive the next day. We do all of this entirely voluntarily, mistakenly calling it self-realization or self-improvement. But Han makes it crystal clear. This auto-exploitation is ruthlessly efficient precisely because it's wrapped up in a deceptive feeling of freedom.
Which brings us to section 3, the religion of capital and debt, a guilt-driven cult.
This whole psychological architecture eventually scales up into a massive consumer society that operates shockingly like a fanatical religion. Drawing on the work of Walter Benjamin, Han argues that capitalism functions as a cult of debt and guilt, but with absolutely no forgiveness. Traditional religions offered grace and atonement, right? Capitalism only offers perpetual indebtedness and the demand for more, more, more. In this system, your suffering is entirely privatized. If you're feeling anxious or depressed, the system tells you to go to therapy or start meditating, but not for genuine healing. No, it's just to get you back on your feet as a functioning, productive worker in the achievement society.
Let's talk about the number 0. Because 0 represents the exact amount of true, unoptimized leisure time we actually allow ourselves. We are utterly terrified of the freedom that comes with simply doing nothing. We've totally lost the capacity for what Han calls contemplative rest. Just think about it for a second. Are your weekends packed with listening to podcasts at 2x speed, going to networking events, relentlessly curating your digital identity? We live in a world where even basic idleness has to be justified as recharging for work.
All right, Section 4, Infocrocracy and the Digital Swarm, the Illusion of Transparency. The smartphone and the internet, they basically poured gasoline on the fire of this achievement society. We've moved away from physical, oppressive surveillance into this wild era where we enthusiastically monitor ourselves. We didn't end up getting George Orwell's 1984, where a totalitarian state forces cameras into our homes. No way. Instead, we voluntarily bought the cameras. We put them in our pockets, and we eagerly upload every single thought, our location, our lunch. We've turned our devices into these mobile confessionals, actively building a digital panopticon where total transparency is the absolute rule.
And the craziest part is, this system doesn't even need to control our physical bodies anymore. It extracts value directly from our emotions. Han calls this psychopolitics. Through algorithms and big data, the system maps out our inner psyche. It doesn't prohibit us from doing things. It gently nudges, predicts, and commercializes our deepest desires. It effectively replaces genuine community, which, by the way, requires mutual obligation, real friction, and shared silence, with these easily manipulated digital profiles that offer the illusion of connection without any of the actual substance.
Finally, let's look at Section 5, the sovereign power of no, the radical rebellion.
So you're probably wondering, how do we actually resist a system that operates entirely inside our own minds and our own devices? Well, to escape this violence of consensus and relentless positivity, the most radical act isn't some violent physical protest. Actually, it's becoming what Han terms the philosophical idiot, and that's not an insult. In a world demanding constant communication, total transparency, and endless optimization, the idiot is the ultimate modern heretic. This is someone who strategically unplugs, who flat out refuses to share their data, who rejects the endless compulsion to be interesting, and who firmly reclaims the power of the outside.
By embracing Eastern concepts of absence and strategic idleness, we can actually step outside those algorithmic metrics. We absolutely have to reclaim silence in a world that is just drowning in digital noise. We need to practice not doing. And I don't mean that as laziness, but as a deliberate, fierce refusal to be productive. And most importantly, we must exercise the sovereign no. It's having the power to recognize the endless demands for performance and firmly state that enough is enough, allowing yourself to exist without the constant need to perform or produce.
Because true freedom in the 21st century is definitely not the ability to optimize every single second of your day. As the philosopher Gilles Deleuze recognized, we aren't suffering from a lack of expression, we are quite literally being choked by forced expression. True freedom is the sovereign power to reject the hustle entirely. It's the ability to carve out these little gaps of solitude and to vigorously protect your interior life from being converted into data and capital. So I want to leave you with this final thought for today's explainer. True rebellion begins the exact moment you give yourself permission to simply exist. In a world that constantly equates your inherent worth with your productive output, choosing to not optimize, to not engage in the digital swarm, and to just be still, well, that is the most profound act of resistance. So ask yourself, what are you going to leave undone today to reclaim your humanity? Really think about that. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you in the next explainer.
So picture this scenario for a second. You're lying in bed, it's late, the room is completely dark, and you are fundamentally biologically exhausted.
Oh yeah, we've all been there.
Right. Your eyes are heavy, your body is just aching for sleep, and yet there you are, illuminated by that cold glue glow of your smartphone. You're just scrolling.
Just endlessly scrolling, yeah.
And as you scroll, this heavy, kind of invisible weight settles on your chest. It's a very specific, modern flavor of guilt.
The guilt that you didn't accomplish enough today.
Exactly. Guilt that your morning routine wasn't, perfectly optimized, or that you didn't make progress on that side hustle. You just have this sinking feeling that you are somehow falling short of your absolute maximum potential.
Which is wild, because there's no actual antagonist in that room with you.
Right. The strange part is the complete absence of anyone forcing you to do anything. No boss is calling your phone at midnight to yell at you. No overseer is standing in your bedroom making you work.
In a purely legal and physical sense, you are completely free.
Totally free. Yet you feel this immense crushing pressure to perform. Where is that coming from?
Well, that phenomenon, that's a specific localized feeling of failing a test that literally no one is grading, That is arguably the defining psychological paradox of our current era. We are basically haunted by the demands of a system that we mistake for our own internal drive.
And that internal drive, or what we think is our internal drive, is the focal point of today's deep dive. We are exploring the philosophy of Byung-Chul Han.
Yeah, the South Korean-born philosopher based in Berlin.
Exactly. He spent the last decade diagnosing this exact modern condition. And our mission today is to really unpack the psychological architecture of modern capitalism and consumerism based on his work. We're looking at how systemic domination has mutated.
It's mutated from an external force to an internal one.
Right. We're moving from a world where power was this external thing, something you could physically point to and resist, to a world where power is basically an internal psychological trap.
Yeah, and before we really get into the weeds, we should probably set some boundaries for the discussion.
Oh, for sure. I want to note right up front for you listening, Han's philosophical critiques deal really heavily with the mechanics of neoliberalism, global economics, societal
It
structures.
can get quite political in its implications.
It definitely can, but our aim today isn't to validate a specific political platform or, endorse a partisan critique of global economics. We are just objectively exploring and reporting on Han's structural argument to understand the architecture of his ideas. We're just observing the mechanism he describes.
It is a fascinating mechanism. I mean, it really requires us to rethink our most basic assumptions about freedom.
How so?
Well, the overarching premise of Han's work is that we've transitioned into what he calls the achievement society. We walk around operating under the assumption that we are pursuing self-realization and individual liberty.
Right, the whole be your best self thing.
Exactly. But the tragic irony, Han points out, is that this exact pursuit of unbridled potential has been co-opted. It has secretly become the ultimate, most highly efficient mechanism of our own self-exploitation.
Wow. Okay, so to understand how this trap operates today, I think we have to look at the trap we left behind.
Yeah, the historical context is crucial here.
So we all know Michel Foucault's concept of the disciplinary society. Anyone who has taken a 20th century sociology class is familiar with the panopticon, this structural reliance on physical boundaries.
Prisons, military barracks, factories, madhouses.
Exactly. The architecture of the 19th and 20th centuries was totally defined by physical walls and strict spatial organization. It was essentially the architecture of thou shalt not.
Or you must. Yeah, the disciplinary society was fundamentally a society of negativity. It operated on prohibition, constraint, compliance.
It was always external.
Right, like you clock in at this exact hour, you do not cross this line, you perform this repetitive task. Power was exercised by actively suppressing what the individual wanted and forcing them into a mold of obedience.
But Han identifies a structural limitation to that old form of power, right?
Yeah.
A system based on coercion and negativity eventually hits a ceiling.
It hits a massive ceiling of productivity. Because, I mean, you can only threaten someone so much before they simply break down.
Or they rebel.
Exactly. They rebel, or they just do the absolute bare minimum required to avoid being punished. Coercion just doesn't scale infinitely. It creates profound friction in the system.
So to push beyond that productivity ceiling, the whole societal paradigm had to shift. Society transitioned from that disciplinary model to the achievement society.
And the physical environments we inhabit transformed right along with it.
Right. So the grim, imposing walls of the factory and the asylum got replaced. Now we have environments that actually simulate freedom and transparency.
Think about the modern glass office tower or the open plan workspace.
Oh, man, the 24-hour fitness center, the genetic optimization lab, even just the local coffee shop where freelancers work entirely on their own schedules.
Yeah, those environments are aesthetically very liberating. They're flooded with natural light. They've got ping pong tables in the break room, cold brew on tap.
But Han argues this physical shift is mirrored by a much more insidious linguistic shift. The ruling modal verb of our culture shifted.
It shifted from should to can.
Yes. From should, which is the language of obligation, to can, the language of potential. The ultimate cultural slogan of the 21st century basically became, yes, we can.
Which introduces what Han brilliantly calls the violence of positivity.
The violence of positivity, that sounds like an oxymoron.
It does, right?
Yeah.
On the surface, shifting from should to can sounds like the absolute pinnacle of human emancipation. But you have to consider the structural difference. Should has a built-in limit.
Right.
If an external boss dictates that you should dig a ditch or assemble a car, your obligation is over the second that specific task is finished. The boundary is totally clear.
But can is different.
Can is infinite. There is literally no natural limit to what you can do or what you can become or how much you can optimize yourself.
That lack of a boundary is honestly terrifying when you apply it to human psychology. Let me throw a metaphor at you to see if it captures this shift.
Yeah, go for it.
So, the disciplinary society was essentially a cage. You knew exactly where the iron bars were. You hated the cage. You probably resented the guard. But you knew its limits. You could lean against the bars and actually rest.
Okay, I like that.
But the new system, the achievement society, takes you out of the cage, drops you into this massive, gorgeous open field, and tells you to run as fast and as far as you possibly can forever because your potential is limitless. It frames the open field as empowerment, but isn't it really just a recipe for endless exhaustion?
That is a deeply accurate translation of Han's critique.
Yeah.
That open field represents the ultimate illusion of freedom. Modern power no longer operates by prohibiting your actions.
It doesn't need to.
Right, it operates by seducing your desires. Domination today functions by exploiting freedom itself. By continuously telling you that you are a project of unlimited potential, the system ensures that you will just keep running in that open field until you experience total physiological and psychological collapse.
Because you aren't running because a guard is whipping you.
Exactly. You are running because you have fully internalized the belief that running is the only way to actualize your own worth.
Which brings us to arguably the most complex part of this whole architectural shift, which is the relocation of the master.
The merging of the master and the slave.
Right. Historically, we had clear frameworks for this. We can look at the Hegelian master-slave dialectic, which relies on a struggle between two distinct, separate consciousnesses. Or traditional Marxist class struggle, the bourgeoisie extracting surplus value from the proletariat.
The exploiter and the exploited were two different entities. They occupied different ends of a physical and economic space.
Right, the relationship was external. And because the oppressor is someone else, resistance is structurally possible. Workers can identify their shared exploitation, form a union, go on strike, launch a revolution. There is a tangible target.
But Han's observation is that in the neoliberal achievement society, that distinct external oppressor has just been structurally dissolved.
They haven't disappeared.
No, the master and the slave haven't disappeared at all. They have just collapsed into a single human psyche. We have literally become the entrepreneurs of ourselves.
We are simultaneously the manager, demanding higher quarterly yields, and the exhausted worker suffering the stress of delivering them.
Han actually uses this really specific kind of disturbing analogy from Franz Kafka to illustrate the pathology of this dynamic.
Oh, the animal with the whip.
Yes. Kafka describes an animal that snatches the whip from its master and begins to viciously whip itself, under the delusion that by becoming the one who wields the whip, it has somehow become the master.
Completely ignoring the fact that its own back is the one bleeding.
Exactly. It's a tragic delusion.
And that dynamic is so deeply embedded in modern corporate and entrepreneurial language. The mandate to be your own boss, take ownership, hustle culture.
Oh, absolutely.
When I stay up until 3 in the morning refining a presentation, I get a rush of dopamine. I feel like I'm the master of my own destiny, actively conquering my environment. But biologically, my body is just the exhausted laborer enduring sleep deprivation.
And the system evolved in this direction because auto-exploitation, exploiting oneself, is just exponentially more efficient than allo-exploitation, being exploited by an external force.
It's the friction thing again.
Exactly. When external forces compel labor, they face inevitable resistance, sabotage, biological limits. But when exploitation is wrapped up in the phenomenological experience of freedom, personal ambition, and self-realization, all that resistance just vanishes.
You will extract far more labor from yourself than any tyrant could ever force out of you.
It is the perfect system of domination because it operates entirely without the friction of coercion.
The fallout of the system is really fascinating when you compare it to the disciplinary era. Foucault noted that the restrictive, rule-bound disciplinary society created criminals and madmen.
Right, people who actively transgress the boundaries, or whose psychology is just fractured under the rigid confinement.
But Han suggests our open field achievement society generates a completely different psychological profile. It creates what he calls depressives and losers.
It is a stark categorization, for sure. But it speaks to the structural internalization of failure.
How so?
Well, in a society governed by the violence of positivity, where the cultural mantra is absolute capability, failing to achieve is no longer viewed as a consequence of systemic inequality or just bad luck.
It's seen as your fault.
Entirely.
Yeah.
It is internalized entirely as a personal ontological deficit. Hahn argues that modern burnout and depression are not merely clinical phenomena. They are the result of an individual who is quite literally unable to can anymore.
The soul just overheats.
Yeah. When you contain both the master and the slave within your own mind, there is no physical location you can retreat to for sanctuary. You can never take a day off from yourself.
Okay, let's apply some pressure to this theory, though. Let's consider a listener who has a deep, intrinsic passion. Let's say they are an indie game developer, or a writer, or someone deeply involved in community organizing, and they voluntarily work 14-hour days, not for a corporation, but out of sheer love for the craft.
They're pursuing their own calling, essentially.
Right. Does Hahn's framework suggest that even intrinsic joy is just disguised self-exploitation? Where is the line between authentic passion and this internalized master-slave dynamic?
That is a really great question, and the ambiguity of that exact line is where neoliberal capitalism extracts its most potent value. Hahn would argue that the achievement society is uniquely adept at colonizing intrinsic motivation.
It hijacks the passion.
Precisely. The danger arises when the pure practice of a craft is subtly hijacked by the compulsion to optimize it, scale it, and render it visible. So your indie developer might start with pure passion, but very quickly they feel this immense pressure to build a personal brand, optimize their devlogs for algorithmic reach, monetize their Discord community.
So the passion gets subsumed by the logic of performance.
Exactly. When the activity ceases to be an end in itself and just becomes a metric of personal optimization, the passion has been weaponized.
It transforms from play into production. And the most isolating aspect of this is what Hahn calls the privatization of suffering.
Right, because when that passion project inevitably leads to burnout, the individual doesn't critique the socioeconomic structures that demanded constant monetization.
The system is completely safe from critique.
Completely inoculated.
Right.
Because the individual absorbs all the blame, they view their own exhaustion as a failure of mindset, a lack of resilience, or just insufficient discipline on their part.
Which introduces a really fascinating theological dimension to Hahn's critique. This intense, internalized guilt for failing to produce at maximum capacity, it really mirrors a deeply religious dynamic.
It really does. And Hahn borrows heavily here from the philosopher Walter Benjamin, who proposed that capitalism is not merely an economic system, but an actual religion.
Benjamin called it a cult, right?
Yeah, he categorized it as perhaps the most extreme, unrelenting cult ever devised, because it is a religion composed entirely of cultic practice without any underlying theology or dogma to offer grace.
The core mechanism Benjamin identified, and that Hahn expands upon, is that capitalism is the first religion that creates guilt and debt without offering any mechanism for atonement or absolution.
And the linguistic connection in German is so vital here. The word should literally means both debt and guilt.
Wow. Debt and guilt are the same word.
Same word. In traditional religious frameworks, there is an established pathway for redemption. You commit a transgression, you confess, you perform a designated penance, and you are absolved. The slate is wiped clean.
But in the religion of capitalism?
In the religion of capitalism, capital is the supreme deity, and the individual owes an infinite, unpayable debt of productivity. There is literally no finish line. There is no specific net worth or professional milestone where the system grants you absolution and says, you have achieved enough, you are saved.
The moment you reach a milestone, the horizon just recedes. You hit a revenue target, and the board immediately adjusts the next quarter's target upward. Because the debt is infinite, the concept of rest undergoes this radical redefinition.
Right. Rest is stripped of its biological necessity. It loses its sacred meaning.
Instead, rest is framed as a moral failure, a lapse in devotion to the cult of performance.
That perfectly explains the phenomenology of the midnight scrolling you mentioned at the very beginning of the deep dive. That guilt you feel in the dark, that is the religious guilt of the capitalist cult. You are feeling the weight of the schuld, the debt and the guilt, because you failed to offer enough productive sacrifice that day.
And this cult is highly expansive. Hahn discusses the evolution into what he calls emotional capitalism. The system no longer just contents itself with commodifying material labor, it commodifies the soul, our meaning, and our emotions.
We see this so deeply in modern marketing. I mean, capitalism used to be concerned with utility, right? You bought a car for transportation.
Now it sells identity and moral alignment.
Exactly. Values such as justice, sustainability, and empathy are abstracted, packaged, and sold right back to the consumer.
The sources gave the example of buying vegan, fair trade shoes.
Right. When an individual purchases those shoes, the marketing apparatus assures them they are participating in a moral crusade. They are saving the world. But Hahn is deeply critical of this. He argues it is an illusion of political action that actually just serves to boost the consumer's narcissistic ego.
The consumer is essentially just buying an identity to augment their personal brand. The desire for ethical engagement has been seamlessly absorbed into the cycle of consumption.
The system digests our morality and just turns it into a transaction.
And the liturgy of this religion, like the daily practice of devotion, is deeply tied to data. Hahn writes extensively about the quantified self. If capital is the deity, then datism is the orthodox practice.
The compulsion to self-optimize requires constant granular measurement. Hahn draws this really striking parallel, comparing the modern smartphone and wearable tech to a digital rosary or a mobile confessional.
The imagery there is visceral. We strap sensors to our wrists, and we essentially confess our biological realities to the algorithm every second of the day.
We track our REM sleep, our caloric deficits, our daily step counts, our heart rate variability.
People are even using biometric trackers to optimize their meditation sessions, which honestly has to be the ultimate philosophical contradiction.
Oh, absolutely.
We have taken an ancient practice designed to dissolve the ego and detach from the material world and turned it into a high-score arcade game where we proudly post our optimized resting heart rate graphs on social media.
It just demonstrates the absolute totality of the conditioning. We voluntarily reduce ourselves to a dashboard of metrics to prove our worth to the system. We confess our data, hoping for digital validation. But Hahn cautions that data is inherently blind.
What do you mean by blind?
It is additive, not narrative. It provides a sheer volume of information, but it is devoid of truth or meaning. Counting your heartbeats doesn't tell you if you're actually living a meaningful life.
Which is such a profound point. This obsession with metrics deeply alters our relationship with our own existence. If we are merely biological machines striving to optimize our data outputs, we completely lose touch with classical philosophical notions of the good life.
Right, the good life, in the classical sense explored by Aristotle or later philosophers, that necessitates an acceptance of limits. It involves an embrace of mortality, finding meaning in contemplation, communal bonds, and just the inherent friction of existence.
But Hahn argues we have abandoned this in favor of worshiping what he calls mere life.
Mere life or bare life being the absolute prioritization of biological continuity over actual lived experience.
It is a state of aggressively optimized survival. Society is increasingly obsessed with fitness, biohacking longevity, and maximizing biological efficiency, often at the direct expense of engaging in a life that contains risk, passion, or deep philosophical meaning.
We treat the human body as a machine that must be perfectly maintained so it can continue to generate data and capital. But the spirit operating the machine is totally hollowed out.
The profound fear of death and limits drives us to optimize ourselves into this sterile state where we are surviving indefinitely but not truly living.
It's a really bleak diagnosis.
It is, which naturally transitions us into the macro-level implications of all this data we are generating. If millions of individuals are frantically self-exploiting, tracking their mere life, and voluntarily confessing every metric to the cloud, how does this aggregate data construct the society around us?
That's where Hahn moves from internal psychology to structural surveillance. He describes our current era as an infocracy governed by the digital swarm.
To grasp the architecture of this infocracy, I think we have to briefly revisit Foucault's disciplinary society and Jeremy Bentham's concept of the panopticon.
Good idea. The classic panopticon was a circular prison with a central watchtower. The inmates in the cells could not see into the tower, so they had to assume they were always being watched. The mechanism of control was forced, asymmetrical transparency.
The inmates despised the transparency, but the physical architecture gave them no choice but to internalize the guard's gaze and police their own behavior.
Right, but the digital panopticon of the Achievement Society is radically different because it lacks the friction of coercion. We are not forced into transparency by an external authority.
We do it to ourselves.
We build, maintain, and fiercely defend the digital panopticon ourselves. We do this entirely voluntarily, driven by a narcissistic need for exhibition and validation.
We actively crave the gaze of the tower. We utilize hashtags, location tags, and carefully curated aesthetics to ensure the digital guard does not overlook us. We actually panic if we are not being watched.
And because the exposure is voluntary and tied to our sense of self-worth, it is infinitely more potent. This marks the transition from Foucault's biopolitics, which was the administration and control of physical bodies, to Hahn's psychopolitics.
Psychopolitics, so it's about the mind.
Exactly. Psychopolitics doesn't care where your physical body is located. It is concerned with mapping, predicting, and subtly guiding your desires, fears, and behaviors.
And the mechanism of psychopolitics relies entirely on big data. By freely confessing our search histories, our geographic movements, our lingering screen times, and our biometric reactions, we hand over the raw material needed for predictive algorithms.
Which brings us to a highly specific, honestly chilling example of this mechanism in practice that the sources highlighted. The data brokerage firm Axiom.
Axiom, yeah, this part of the deep dive is wild.
It serves as a perfect empirical manifestation of Hahn's theory. At the time Hahn was writing about this, Axiom had managed to compile exhaustive profiles on roughly 300 million Americans.
Which is essentially the entire adult population of the country.
Basically, yes. And they didn't just collect data, they processed it to categorize humanity into 70 distinct algorithm buckets based on thousands of behavioral data points.
This isn't just targeted advertising, it's an algorithmic caste system. One of the specific categories they created is literally called the shooting star.
Right. The shooting star profile represents individuals with high economic velocity.
These are dynamic individuals, early risers, frequent travelers, people who perhaps engage in specific cultural consumption, like they watch Seinfeld or they buy organic produce.
The algorithm identifies them as highly profitable, so they are seamlessly integrated into the premium tiers of the Achievement Society. They're targeted with prime credit offers, investment opportunities, VIP consumer experiences.
The system aggressively courts them. But the dark underbelly of this categorization is what happens at the bottom of the algorithmic hierarchy. There is a category literally designated as waste or trash.
Yes, waste or trash. Individuals sorted into that category are deemed by the algorithm to possess low or negative economic value.
Or it's just dystopian.
The implications are profound.
Yeah.
This isn't a physical prison. It's an invisible architecture of exclusion. Hahn terms this the panopticon.
The panopticon. So a system designed not to watch and discipline, but to identify and banish.
Exactly. The traditional panopticon sought to keep everyone inside the system, under discipline, to extract labor. The panopticon utilizes psychopolitical data to silently identify the unprofitable, the marginalized, and the unwanted, and seamlessly exclude them from the system.
So they are quietly denied credit, filtered out of job applications, offered predatory subprime loans, or geographically redlined by digital services.
And the most insidious aspect is the invisibility of it all. You do not know which of the 70 categories you have been sorted into. Your ontological status in society is being dictated by opaque algorithms processing the data you eagerly volunteered.
It is a form of structural violence that is entirely invisible, and this completely shatters the early utopian promises of the internet, doesn't it?
Oh, completely.
I mean, the internet was conceptualized as this ultimate democratizing force, a tool that would build global solidarity, level hierarchies, empower the masses against the elite.
But Hahn argues that the internet achieved the exact opposite. Instead of forging a connected global community, it fractured us into isolated digital swarms. And it is vital to understand the structural difference between a traditional mass and a modern swarm.
Right. In the 20th century, we saw the power of the mass, the labor movements, the civil rights marches of the 1960s. A mass movement had a defined ideological core.
A mass possesses a unified voice and a shared narrative. When workers or citizens formed a mass, they forged a collective we. And that collective solidarity possessed the gravitational pull necessary to actually affect structural political change, to negotiate with power, or to launch a revolution. They moved in a unified direction.
But a digital swarm, by contrast, possesses absolutely no internal cohesion.
None. A swarm is merely a hyper-fragmented collection of isolated individuals just buzzing in the same digital space.
They generate immense friction and noise. They swarm around a trending topic or a perceived slight, generating what Hahn translates directly as shitstorms of fleeting outrage.
But the outrage never coalesces into a political movement. It dissipates as quickly as it forms because the swarm lacks a shared ideology or a collective we. It is bound only by transient emotion and algorithmic trending topics.
So once the digital stimulus changes, the swarm just changes direction.
Exactly. It is fundamentally incapable of structural political action.
The sheer volume of communication in the swarm masks a profound isolation, which leads to one of Hahn's most central philosophical concerns, the disappearance of the other. Capital O, other, meaning alterity, that which is fundamentally different from ourselves.
True human connection, deep intellectual growth, and genuine political discourse all require a confrontation with the other. You must encounter someone who challenges your assumptions, who introduces friction into your worldview, who holds a mirror up to your flaws.
But the architecture of the infocracy is designed to eliminate friction. Algorithms are calibrated for maximum engagement, which means prioritizing comfort and psychological validation.
The algorithm learns what we prefer and meticulously filters out anything that contradicts it, creating what Hahn refers to as the hell of the same.
The hell of the same. So we are trapped in highly personalized echo chambers. We believe we are connecting with the world, but we're only ever encountering digital mirrors reflecting our own opinions, biases, and desires back at us.
Communication is reduced to a frictionless, narcissistic exchange of likes and retweets.
Yeah.
The other is eradicated, and without the other, we're locked in a feedback loop of our own ego, which only exacerbates that deep psychological exhaustion and isolation of the achievement society.
Wow. Okay, so we have outlined a seemingly inescapable architecture today. We are trapped in a system where we act as our own slave drivers, where we view rest as a sin against the cult of capital, where we voluntarily confess our data to a panopticon that might secretly categorize us as waste, and where we are entirely isolated within digital echo chambers, basically incapable of forming a collective mass.
That's a lot.
It's a lot. Given the invisible, pervasive nature of this trap, what is the mechanism of resistance? Is there a way out?
Well, Hahn's prescription for resistance is highly unconventional. He does not advocate for a traditional political uprising, nor does he suggest, a Luddite rejection of technology. Instead, he proposes a radical ontological shift embodied in the figure of the philosophical idiot.
The philosophical idiot. That sounds inherently counterintuitive in a society that prizes hyperintelligence and data processing.
It is a deliberate provocation by Hahn. In a society where the absolute ruling mandate is, yes, we can, where freedom is exclusively defined as the active ability to do, to achieve, to optimize, and to conquer. Hahn argues that true sovereignty requires the opposite capability.
True freedom is the power to say no.
Yes, it is the reclamation of the power of not doing.
We are so conditioned to view negative liberty, the absence of action, as a failure.
We really are. To construct this alternative framework, Hahn synthesizes his critique with Eastern philosophy, heavily contrasting it against the Western philosophical tradition.
Okay, let's break that down.
So, the Western tradition is overwhelmingly obsessed with essence, permanence, imposition, and absolute transparency. The Western ideal is the hero who imposes their will upon the world, who leaves a permanent mark, who conquers nature. Hahn points to Hegel's characterization of the sea.
How does Hegel view the sea?
Western thought views the sea as an imposing force that must be confronted with cunning, courage, and technological mastery. It must be conquered.
It's the drive to build the transparent, indestructible glass tower, to dominate the landscape. But the Eastern philosophical approach, particularly in Taoist and Zen traditions, operates on a completely different frequency. It privileges absence over essence.
Exactly. Instead of conquering the sea, Eastern thought looks to the nature of water itself. Water does not impose its shape, it yields and molds to the shape of its container, finding power in its adaptability and its lack of rigid form.
The sage in Eastern philosophy does not seek to leave a permanent monument. The sources mention the Taoist idea that a good walker leaves no tracks.
Which is wild because in the Western achievement society, leaving no tracks is the ultimate failure.
Right. If you didn't document your journey, if you didn't build your personal brand, if you didn't leave a data trail, you effectively do not exist. But in the Eastern framework, operating in emptiness and absence is the pinnacle of mastery. It is an embrace of the transient, the imperfect, and the incomplete.
We can see this aestheticized in the Japanese concept of wabi. Wabi finds profound beauty in the unpolished, the asymmetrical, the fragile, and the incomplete.
Like a wabi tea bowl.
Exactly. Contrast to wabi tea bowl, which might be slightly irregular, bearing the marks of the kiln and the passage of time, with the Western ideal of a hyper-transparent, perfectly symmetrical, flawless glass structure.
The glass structure demands total visibility and perfection. It leaves no room for shadow or imagination, but the wabi bowl accepts absence, shadow, and the unsaid.
Applying this aesthetic to our psychology, Hahn suggests we need to reclaim the capacity for lingering. We need to cultivate silence. Deep thinking and true rationality require temporal space. They require slowness.
But the frantic, algorithmic accumulation of data and the constant demand for instantaneous reaction are actively destroying our capacity for contemplation. We are processing massive amounts of information, but we are losing the ability to actually think.
Hahn points to the original, profound meaning of the Sabbath to illustrate this.
Oh, this is a great point.
In the modern achievement society, we have entirely instrumentalized rest. A day off is culturally framed as a time to recharge your batteries. which is fundamentally a machine metaphor. You recharge your batteries solely so you can return to the office on Monday and produce with greater efficiency. Rest is just a tool for future labor.
Consumerist self-care operates on this exact logic too. Buy this expensive bath bomb, go on this wellness retreat so you can optimize your stress levels and hustle harder next quarter.
But the original theological concept of the Sabbath translates literally to starving or ceasing to do. It is a designated period of time that is meant to be completely defiantly useless to the economy.
Han argues we must reclaim this uselessness. We must reclaim boredom.
Yes, deep boredom. Boredom is not a negative void that must be frantically filled with smartphone scrolling. Deep boredom is a profound, necessary psychological space. It is only in the space of deep boredom that genuine creativity and truly new ideas can emerge.
Okay, I have to challenge the practical application of this, though.
Yeah.
Han's philosophy is deeply compelling in the abstract, but imagine a listener who is working 3 gig economy jobs just to make rent. Or someone drowning in corporate demands under threat of layoffs.
Right, the material reality.
Telling them to simply say no, to embrace the aesthetic of wabi, or to cultivate deep boredom, it feels disconnected from material reality. How does an individual enact the philosophical idiot when the structural demands of capitalism are literally threatening their basic survival?
It is the most critical challenge to his work, honestly. But Han is not suggesting a naive, individualistic retreat. Practicing the philosophical idiot is not about taking a bubble bath and turning off your phone for an hour while the world burns.
Because that is merely retreating into consumerist isolation.
Exactly. What Han is advocating for is a radical, fundamental shift in our relational ontology, how we relate to the world and to others. It requires abandoning the narcissism of continuous self-production. And the most practical, radical tool for this, according to Han, is deep listening.
How does the act of listening disrupt the achievement society?
Because the achievement society traps us entirely within the time of the self. We are constantly projecting our brand, stating our opinions, curating our image, and seeking validation. We only hear our own echoes. Deep, empathetic listening requires an active emptying of the self.
It requires you to suspend your own agenda.
To stop calculating how you will respond and to genuinely pay attention to the time of the other.
So, by truly listening to another human being without trying to extract networking value from them, without trying to optimize the interaction, you are completely short-circuiting the logic of neoliberal capitalism.
You are treating the other as a profound mystery to be encountered, rather than a data point to be consumed or a mirror to validate your own ego. Deep listening is the antithesis of the digital swarm. It is the foundational practice required to rebuild the shattered, isolated communities that the infocracy has dismantled. It is in that space of profound attention to the other that true resistance begins.
We have charted a really complex evolution today. The fundamental takeaway is a radical re-diagnosis of where power resides. True domination in the 21st century does not rely on physical force, surveillance towers, or a boot on your neck.
It operates much more efficiently than that.
It occurs when you willingly, eagerly exploit yourself in the name of personal growth. The ultimate trap is the voice in your own head telling you that you haven't optimized your potential.
And real freedom, if we follow Han's architecture, is not the ability to aggressively optimize every waking second of your day.
Real freedom is the sovereign power to say no. It is the right to step entirely outside of the algorithmic metrics. It is the profound right to exist, simply and quietly exist, without having to produce, perform, or generate data for anyone.
It is the radical courage to be beautifully, defiantly useless to the demands of capital.
So later tonight, when you find yourself lying in bed, looking up from the glow of your screen, feeling that familiar heavy weight of exhaustion and unearned guilt, I want you to sit with one question. If our deepest, most visceral desires for success, productivity, and endless self-optimization were actually carefully implanted in us by a system that requires us to willingly exploit ourselves, what does your actual authentic desire look like in a moment where you allow yourself to be completely, gloriously useless to everyone, including yourself?